Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Things You Don't Know. I'm joined, as always, by my mentor and friend, Dr. William Weaver here. We've got a really interesting podcast for you today, and I'm pleased to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the one we just did last week was our 300th podcast. So I am very pleased that we're still in business, and I hope you've learned a few things and enjoyed it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Deneen. We couldn't have done this by myself, and having you and your encyclopedic knowledge of history and your enthusiasm and support has been invaluable to this whole project. And listen, folks, one of the things that you can do to make sure that we're still on the air here is give us a like. Subscribe, doesn't cost a dime. Give comments. Even if it's disagreeing, that's fine, whatever.
We treasure those comments.
We do. And we got some really hot stuff coming your way soon. But today, we're exploring a part of the American Revolution that is too often left out of the story. The Native Americans who fought alongside the colonial army, especially during two defining moments of the war, Valley Forge and the Battle of Monmouth. When most people picture the revolution, they imagine colonial militiamen, George Washington, and British redcoats. If Native Americans appear at all, they're usually portrayed only as allies of the British crown, right, Dr. Deneen?
That's true, Dr. Weaver, and we need to be honest. That image contains some truth. But, ladies and gentlemen, it's far from the whole story. Native nations were not united exclusively behind one side. The revolution forced Native communities to make difficult, sometimes even tragic choices.
Yeah, you're right about that. Some native nations sided with Britain because they believed the British government was more likely than colonial settlers to restrain westward expansion. Got some interesting stories coming up about that. Cumberland Gap and some other things like that. It's really fascinating stuff. But others chose the patriot cause, and understanding why is one of the most important parts of this story today.
It certainly is. It's important to begin with a basic point. Native Americans were not one people with one set of interests. There were hundreds of nations across North America, each with its own leadership, diplomacy, geography, and political concerns.
Exactly. So the question isn't why did Native Americans choose one side? The real question, the real one, is why did some Native communities and some individual Native leaders decide that supporting the Americans gave them the best chance to protect their people?
In some cases, the answer was long standing local relationships. Communities like the Stockbridge Mohicans, for example, in Massachusetts, had lived near English descended colonists for generations.
Mm-hmm.
They had traded with them, negotiated with them, married them in some cases, worshipped alongside missionaries, and in some cases adopted aspects of colonial life while still maintaining their own identity.
That meant the revolution wasn't always seen simply as an outside white conflict. For some native communities, it involved neighbors, allies, trading partners, or even relatives by marriage. Supporting the Patriots could seem like the most practical and familiar choice.
As we just said a moment ago, another reason was political calculation. Some Native leaders believed if the Americans won their independence, Native nations that had supported them might gain influence, or at the very least, favorable treatment or protection in the new republic.
Yeah, that hope turned out to be deeply painful in many cases. Why? Because the United States later broke promises and continued pushing westward, taking native land, moving natives off their land. But at the time, many native leaders were making choices in uncertainty. They were trying to survive a war whose outcome no one could really predict.
There was also the issue of British credibility. Remember, the UK at that time controlled about 40% of the world.
Wow.
While many native nations saw Britain as their protector, as the better option, not everyone trusted the crown equally. A nation that's an empire with that many interests scattered around the world just didn't have the funding or the time, some people believed, to pacify what would become the United States at all costs. Some native leaders had their own grievances with British officials, or, as I said, doubted that distant imperial promises would protect them any better than a local alliance might.
Yeah, um, that's so true. And then there were internal divisions. Villages, clans, and families did not always agree. Some chose Britain, some chose the Americans, and some tried to remain neutral. In many cases, the revolution became a civil war inside Native America as much as it was a war between colonists and the empire.
That's very true. Now, in December of 1777, George Washington led about 12,000 Continental soldiers into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the army was exhausted, hungry, badly clothed, and demoralized after a string of setbacks. Valley Forge would become one of the most famous episodes of the Revolution, not because of a great battle, but because it was a test of endurance.
Men suffered from disease, cold, exposure, and severe food shortages. Nearly 2,000 soldiers died during the encampment, another 1,000 deserted.
Wow. 3,000. Wow. That's a huge number, actually, Dr. Janine.
25% of the whole army.
Yeah. And among those serving with the Continental Forces were Native Americans who had chosen to support the revolutionary cause.
As I said, one of the best known groups was the Stockbridge Mohican Company from Massachusetts. The Stockbridge people had long standing ties with New England communities in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and what would become Maine, and many believed that helping the Patriot cause offered the best chance to defend their heritage and their community's future.
Their service mattered because they brought skills the Continental Army badly needed. Native scouts and warriors often excelled in reconnaissance, tracking, message carrying, and operating independently across difficult terrain.
European armies tended to think in terms of formal lines, set piece battle maneuvers, but war in North America was almost an Iraq or Vietnam style guerrilla war, and it demanded something more. Forests, rivers, rough ground, and uncertain roads made information incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and you mentioned the formal lines and the set piece maneuvers, right, Dr. Dean?
Indeed.
But we're going to do some more things on this, particularly about the fact that a lot of the military tactics and maneuvers are actually more modern than we think.
I was very surprised to learn that, but you're quite correct.
Yeah. Anyhow, getting back to our storyline here, that meant that a good scout could be worth far more than his numbers might suggest. During the Valley Forge months, Native Scouts helped monitor British activity around Philadelphia and moved intelligence through dangerous territory.
Their presence also reminds us, as we've said in other podcasts, that the Continental Army was much more diverse than many people realize. The struggle for American independence included Native Americans, African Americans, free and enslaved alike, immigrants, and foreign volunteers from across Europe.
Yeah, Valley Forge wasn't just the story of suffering soldiers in rags. No, no, no. It was also the story of many different people contributing in various divergent ways to the Army's survival.
Perhaps no Native nation's experience better illustrates the tragedy of the Revolution than that of the Oneida.
Yes, the Oneida were part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. That's a hard one for English speakers to pronounce. It was also known historically as the Iroquois Confederation, one of the most powerful political alliances in North America. For generations, the Confederacy had bound together the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora.
The Revolution shattered that unity. Many Haudenosaunee nations, especially the Mohawk under Joseph Brant, see our podcast about him for more details, supported the British. They believed the British victory offered the best chance of slowing settler expansion on the native land.
But the Oneida and often the Tuscarora alongside them largely chose the American side. Why? Why? Partly because of missionary influence, partly because of long-standing ties with nearby colonists, and partly because of their own political judgment about what would best protect their people.
The result was heartbreaking. The war became a civil internecine conflict between the Haudenosaunee world itself.
Oneida scouts carried messages for Washington. Oneida warriors served with Continental forces, and Oneida women reportedly provided desperately needed food to the starving army at Valley Forge, a forgotten piece of history.
Yes, see our Caesar Drake podcast for the role African Americans played in the supply process as well. Meanwhile, other Haudenosaunee nations fought for the crown. So this wasn't simply native versus colonist or British versus American. It was sometimes relative against relative, nation against nation, even brother against brother.
It indeed sounds remarkably like the Civil War.
Oh, quite so.
And there is a story about that. When Dr. Neem was in the fourth grade, he mentioned this concept that the Revolutionary War was also kind of a civil war, and he got kind of really put down and told to shut up.
I did. The following year, though, the very first mainstream teacher I had, God rest his soul, Mr. Daniel Semenza, had me do a whole presentation on that. I never forgot it. And I said to myself, when I become an adult, I'm going to tell this story. And now, friends, you've let me tell it.
And you know what? It's a great example of why I enjoy working with you, Dr. Neen, because you got some of these great ideas. You think about stuff. And I really like that. I do. Okay, so one of the deepest tragedies of the revolution is that Native peoples were not just caught up in the war, they were forced to choose inside it.
One extraordinary example is a man called Colonel Lewis Cook.
He deserves special attention because his life captures both the complexity and the divisions of the era. Born around 1740 to the Abenaki, a mother and an African father, he was adopted and raised in the Mohawk community of Kanawaki near Montreal.
Converted to Catholicism by Jesuit missionaries, he spoke French, English, and Mohawk. Before the Revolution, he fought for France in the French and Indian War and built a reputation as a skilled warrior and leader of men.
Then came the revolution and another hard choice. While Joseph Brant and many Mohawks supported Britain, he chose the American cause.
That decision placed him in direct opposition to many fellow Haudenosaunee. He worked closely with Oneida allies, serving as a scout, courier, diplomat, and a battlefield commander.
And a very good battlefield commander, too. In 1778, he visited Valley Forge as part of a native delegation supporting Washington's army. His later service in the Northern Theater was substantial, and Congress eventually commissioned him as a lieutenant colonel, making him the highest ranking Native American officer in the Continental Army.
His story is remarkable, Dr. Weaver, not only because of his rank, but because of what it meant. He was a native officer fighting for the American cause in a war that was tearing native political worlds apart.
And like so many others, he was fighting not only imperial forces, but sometimes fellow indigenous people aligned with the other side. Here are some of the main reasons historians point to. He was not aligned with Mohawk leadership in the same way Joseph Brant was. Cook had a different path from many Mohawk loyalists. He was raised in Kanawaki, moved through French, Native, and later American military worlds, and was less tied to the British centered political network that influenced many Mohawk leaders. He had close ties to Native groups who supported the Americans, especially the Oneida. Cook worked closely with Oneida allies of the Continental cause, and those relationships likely mattered more than any abstract idea of siding with, quote, his tribe.
As with so many leaders, he may have believed the Americans were the more practical alliance in his situation. Indigenous leaders often made decisions based on military opportunity, local survival, and existing diplomatic ties. For Colonel Cook, the Patriot side may have simply looked like the stronger or more useful partnership. Now, by the spring of 1778, the Continental Army that emerged from Valley Forge was not the same army that had entered it several months earlier.
Yeah, Baron von Steuben's training had improved drill, discipline, and battlefield coordination. The army was still imperfect, but it was much more capable.
At the same time, after informal support for 2 years, France had entered the war as a full American ally, turning the conflict into a world war and forcing Britain to rethink its strategy.
Yes, very, very, very important. In June of 1778, British forces evacuated Philadelphia and began marching toward New York. Washington saw an opportunity to strike.
The famous Battle of Monmouth took place on June 28, 1778, in New Jersey in brutal heat. See my good friend Dr. Mark Lender's book, Fatal Sunday, for the details about that.
Yet temperatures were so high that more soldiers collapsed from the weather than were killed by enemy fire.
And once again, native scouts played a very important role. Stockbridge warriors, and likely Oneida participants as well, helped provide reconnaissance, and intelligence during the campaign.
That mattered enormously. Commanders needed to know where the enemy was moving, how strong they were, and what the ground ahead looked like. In a war where visibility was limited and rapid information was very hard to obtain, native scouts often had an edge that armies could not easily replace.
At Monmouth, Washington's troops showed how much they had improved since Valley Forge. They stood against British regulars in intense combat and did not collapse.
The battle ended tactically inconclusive, but strategically, it was a major American success. The British continued their withdrawal, and the Continental Army proved it could stand up to British troops in open battle.
Native participants played a strong role in that achievement. Colonel Moses Hazen, commander of a pro American Canadian group, see our podcast about him, said the indigenous troops fought better than 90% of Washington's army. They were part of that army's spiritual and military transformation and a great part of its success.
So, what makes this history so important is that it resists easy simplification.
As we said, some Native Americans supported the revolution because of local alliances. Some hoped to secure a political influence in a new United States. Some were persuaded by Catholic or Protestant missionaries or long standing ties to colonial communities, and some made pragmatic military decisions based on geography, trade, and immediate survival.
And some likely believed that choosing a side early and choosing the eventual winner might help protect their towns, lands, or diplomatic standing after the war.
I cannot emphasize enough these choices were made under impossible conditions. Native nations were pressured by both sides, British and American alike. Some tried to be neutral, but neutrality was extremely difficult to maintain. And no matter which side they chose, many would suffer.
That's what gives this story so much emotional force. Many native warriors fought bravely for the American cause only to see the new United States continue the expansion that threatened native homelands in the first place.
That's very true, Dr. Weaver. So many times it's easy to talk about campaigns and logistics and lose sight of the people involved.
Yeah, imagine a native scout at Valley Forge standing watch in bitter cold, carrying messages through dangerous country, uncertain whether the army will survive the winter.
Then imagine that same man, ladies and gentlemen, months later in the blistering heat of Monmouth, New Jersey, watching an army that is stronger, steadier, and more confident than it had been before, just as he is.
He's not a footnote. He's part of the story of how that army endured and changed.
And tragically, yet for generations, stories like this, African Americans, Native Americans, and women, were pushed to the margins of popular memory.
History is often simplified into clean categories: patriot and loyalist, American and British, victory and defeat.
But the revolution, my friends, was far more complex than that. Native Americans, as we said, were not merely bystanders to the war. They were active participants who made difficult decisions, risked their lives, took other real risks, and influenced events.
Some fought for Britain, some fought for the United States, some tried to stay out of the war altogether. All were navigating a world of danger, uncertainty, and enormous political change.
Remembering Native American service at Valley Forge, Monmouth, and elsewhere doesn't take anything away from Washington or the gallant Continental Army.
It does the opposite. It gives us a fuller, more honest picture of how the revolution was actually fought and of who helped fight it.
When we remember Valley Forge, we should not only remember the famous generals and the suffering soldiers, but the native scouts, messengers, women suppliers, and warriors of all background who kept that army alive and supported it through that winter.
And when we remember Monmouth, we should remember that Native Americans helped gather intelligence, read the landscape, and strengthen the army that faced Britain on that blazingly hot June day.
Their contributions may not appear on currency, in the most famous paintings, or in monuments.
But they remain an essential part of the revolutionary story. I want to thank you all for listening and again encourage you to give us a like, comments, and subscribe.
There's an awful lot of interesting stuff coming up, folks. I really think you'll enjoy it. Come back soon.
Bye for now.